Kory's Rides podcast. Today I'm going to talk to you about Victory Motorcycles and their parent company, Polaris Industries. I'll share my firsthand knowledge of Victory motorcycles, and we'll go over the history of both Polaris and Victory and where they're at today. So let's go ahead and roll the intro and get into it. First, let's go over some quick basic facts on Victory motorcycles. Victory started in 1998 under the parent company Polaris Industries, with final assembly being done at their Spirit Lake, Iowa plant. Polaris ceased production of Victory in 2017 as they shifted to the Indian Motorcycles brand, with Indian being produced under Polaris since 2011. If you want to know more about Indian, just check out the podcast I did on them, which was episode number 1. Their first motorcycle was the V92C. Not a very catchy name. 1997, it was unveiled in a very American way. At Planet Hollywood, in the Mall of America, by Al Unser Jr., who is a successful race car driver from New Mexico, if you were not aware. Victory had around 19 different models throughout their run, depending on if you count the special editions or not. They produced cruiser-type V-twin motorcycles for the entire time they were around. So after that quick glance at them, let's go on to the timeline history segment. To talk about Victory, we need to start with Polaris. Something you might notice about their logo is the star in the letter O. The North Star is called Polaris and is more constant than magnetic compasses. It's been used as a navigation point for thousands of years, but Polaris, the company, has only been around for 69 years. Nice. Polaris was founded in 1954 in Rousseau, which is way up north in Minnesota. Nowadays, they're based out of Medina, which is closer to the Twin Cities. Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you're not from around here. They make four-wheelers, side-by-side snowmobiles, a three-wheeled thing called the Slingshot, and they even make some boats. They made PWCs, personal watercraft, or as most people call them, jet skis, for a while in the late 90s and early 2000s. Jet ski is actually Kawasaki's name for their PWCs, but it's the generic term that most people use for jet-propelled personal watercraft. Polaris actually made Sea Lion with the model designators under that broad term. So jet skis are Kawasaki, wave runners are Yamaha, Sea Lions are Polaris. The first Polaris vehicle was in 1953, and it was the genesis of the snowmobile. It was made out of a grain elevator belt, a Briggs & Stratton engine, and skis made from a Chevy bumper. It was created to make winter hunting easier, and it was built on the clock while the owner of Hatteen, Hoist, and Derrick was off on a business trip. Luckily, nobody got fired. They were able to sell it and pay everyone their wages that week, and then they started to produce them. The first models rolled out in 1956, and they called them the Polaris Snow Traveler, S-N-O, Snow Traveler. They weighed around 1,000 pounds and only went 20 miles an hour. To prove their worth and reliability, Edgar Hatteen, who is a co-owner of the business, took 3 of those machines on a trip across Alaska. The trip caused some issues back home with the bank and the board of directors, and long story short, he eventually started a rival company, which you know as Arctic Cat today. In the 1980s, Polaris started on ATVs. The 90s brought about Victory, which we'll get into a little more detail in a minute, and they invested in Bramo electric vehicles in 2011, buying it fully in 2015. They purchased a few other small vehicle and boat manufacturers through the 20-teens, and then Indian happened, which we've already gone over. Polaris has a government and defense division as well, and they make a couple models for military use. There's more we could go over with Polaris, but this is a Victory Motorcycles history. Speaking of which, let's start with the different models they made, and in the order they were produced. And then after that, go over their brand culture, how they succeeded and struggled, and how they overcame. As mentioned in the beginning of the episode, their first motorcycle was the V92C, which is kind of just a plain cruiser motorcycle. In 1997, unveiled at Planet Hollywood in the Mall of America by Al Unser Jr., it came with a 92 cubic inch, which is 1,510 cc, V-twin engine, and that was actually one of the largest motorcycle engines available at the time. An interesting fact about that engine is it actually used mostly General Motors automotive parts for the fuel injection system. In 2000 and 2001, there was a sport trim version available, but it was just the same bike with adjustable suspension to make it taller. It did not sell well, and it was discontinued. The base model eventually became known as the Classic Cruiser, and its run ended in 2003. The Victory marketing team must have hung out in bars a lot because every bike they made after the V92 had some sort of beer-drinking manly man vibe to it. Vegas, Kingpin, Hammer, Gunner, and about half their models, well, actually I think it's more than half. Anyway, you could get them in an 8-ball variant, which is Victory slang for the base model, a lesser model. 8-ball variants were usually powder-coated instead of chromed. They came with less luggage, less options, smaller engines, and it made them cheaper. The V92 was sort of replaced by the Vegas starting in 2003. The touring variant of the V92 continued until 2006. The Vegas had a totally different frame, but it debuted with that older 92 cubic inch engine and a 5-speed. Later, that got upgraded to 100 cubic inches, or 1,600 cc's, and a 6-speed transmission. The Vegas was also offered in the 8-ball trim, and it actually came with a larger engine, 106 cubic inches. Since these are American bikes, I'm not going to do the metric conversions anymore. The Vegas also got a jackpot trim, which was also something that Arlen Ness helped design. We'll get into that later. It looked more like a custom bike than a production model. It had tribal paint accents and really bold colors. It featured a 250 millimeter rear tire, which is pretty wide. And yeah, I know what I just said about the metric stuff. Tires are a little different. After the Vegas took off, Victory released the Kingpin and Kingpin Deluxe in 2004. They added a touring option in 2007, which just added a rear trunk. The Kingpin Tour was a replacement for the V92 touring model, and in 2010 you could also get the Kingpin in the 8-ball specification. Bikes looked a lot like the V92, but they had longer, lower sweeping fenders. Still just a basic cruiser. New for 2005 was the Hammer model. It was more of a muscle cruiser with smaller fenders, fatter tires, and a lower, leaner look. The 106 cubic inch engine made 97 horsepower. The Hammer came in an 8-ball spec, but on the Hammer version, in 8-ball spec, you got a smaller 100-inch motor. After the Hammer came the Vision, and no, not a vision in some mystical sense. The Vision as in more of a, what is it that I'm seeing here kind of way. 2007 was the first year the Victory Vision was produced, and a lot of people either loved it or hated it. It came in a street trim, which they later called the 8-ball, and a touring trim, which was basically the same thing, but with a trunk on it. The bike had a lot of electronics, and it was kind of Victory's answer to the Honda Goldwing and the big Harley touring models. The front end of a Vision resembled an early 2000s BMW touring bike. Broad, wide, swept back. The handlebars appeared to be ape hangers, only if you had laid them down flat to put your hands down over the tank instead of hoisting them up to the sky. The front fairing and the very, very long gas tank flowed in a big swoop toward the rear integrated saddlebags, where the trunk rose upward like an unsightly tumor. Large slash-cut mufflers nestled into cutouts in the lower outside edge of the saddlebags, and it was all pinched together at the rear of the bike around a tall, narrow, V-shaped taillight. As you can tell, I'm not really a fan of the looks. They were very comfortable to ride, though. Once you got past the football field-sized tank between you and the windshield, and the best part was you couldn't see much of the bike while you were on top of it. The Cross Country and the Crossroads models followed in 2010. The Country had a fairing and the Roads had a plain sheet of clear windshield on the front. Both of them were baggers, which, if you're not familiar, is a style of motorcycle less like the Tupperware-covered road sofa that is the Vision, and more of a regular cruiser with hard saddlebags and some wind protection. If you wanted an old-school looking bike from the factory, the Highball was available, starting in 2012. It had fat tires, and you could get it with spoked rims. It had high handlebars, bobbed-looking fenders, and it usually came equipped with white wall tires. They wanted it to look like an old-school 1950s bobber, and it's actually a pretty good-looking bike, I think. If the names of the bikes so far are not manly enough for you, the next bikes were the Judge and the Gunner. Introduced in 2013 and 2014 for the Gunner, both of these bikes were sport cruisers with old-school muscle car styling cues and 106 cubic inch engines. The last model that Victory came out with was the Octane. It was a completely new design, but it contained 35% Indian Scout parts, and if you look at them side by side, they are very similar looking. Engine size was down to 71.9 cubic inches, but it was also liquid-cooled, and it made 104 horsepower. They made 4,000 of these Octane models before they shut down Victory production and put all their effort behind Indian. Some of these bikes, throughout their history, came in limited edition Arlen Ness. Arlen Ness and his son Kory, who spells his name with a C for some reason, their partnership with Victory started in 2003 with work on the Vegas model. The Ness models featured custom paint, billet aluminum parts, and they put their signatures on the side panels. They also made Kingpin and Jackpot bikes with Ness modifications. Wheels, seats, cowlings also appeared on some of these bikes. In 2010, they made very custom, very limited edition bikes with custom everything. Paint, wheels, chrome parts, diamond cut head covers, billet, signatures, everything. They threw the works at them. They all got signed and numbered, but underneath they were all the same Jackpot model motorcycle. You know, it was the same as a base model for performance, engine size, all that. So that's a Victory timeline. They aren't around anymore because they were replaced by Indian, as I've alluded to several times. And you might be wondering why that happened, and the short answer is brand recognition. From day one, Victory had to compete with Harley-Davidson. They had to create a customer base basically out of thin air. Harley had nearly a 100-year head start. The Indian name had been around a lot longer than Victory, and it had been around about as long as Harley, and it was better known as a brand than Victory was. It was an easier product to sell. It was easier to compete against Harley as Indian instead of as Victory. The way that American motorcycle manufacturers grow and succeed is through image. Every Harley and Indian dealership I have been in had a very specifically set up showroom. They want you to see the big expensive bikes right inside the door. They have art all over the walls showing you how much fun their products are, how interesting your life could be if you belong to their special brotherhood. They've got logos plastered all over shirts and socks and pants and belts and wallets and boots and helmets and jackets and everything. Harley-Davidson is really good at this. You see their logo in a lot of places and on a lot of things you wouldn't even really associate with motorcycles. For a while, Ford Motor Company even produced Harley Edition F-150s and F-250s. They want you to become dedicated and proud, flag-waving consumers and unpaid brand ambassadors for their company and their lifestyle products. Now, this isn't exclusive to American motorcycles. A lot of motorcycle companies do this with racing and selling their products, but very specifically with American motorcycle manufacturers, they really like to push that. You know, you'll see 20 Harley-Davidson emblems to every one Honda or Yamaha sticker or KTM sticker you see on a vehicle. It's very prevalent in the way they do business. Anyway, getting back on track. Victory couldn't really inspire the level of emotion in their customers that Harley was capable of doing. And it was really hard to get guys to spend nearly double on a Victory for what a Japanese cruiser sold for. When Harley's standing there offering an American cruiser backed by their history and the knowledge of their products by basically everyone, the widespread nature of their culture, it's a really uphill battle for Victory. Indian was the solution that Polaris needed to really take a bite out of that market share. Polaris used nostalgia of the Indian name to get people interested. And people love nostalgia. Just look at any current motorcycle manufacturer. Look at Honda. They've got the Monkey, they've got, their classic scooters. They're bringing back the trail bike, the Trail 125, the Cub. Kawasaki's got the 900 that looks like, the old Z900s. Everyone is using nostalgia to sell motorcycles. Ducati brought back the Scrambler. Harley's been pushing bike design, from the 50s. They've been pushing that forever. You can set those bikes from the 50s near the ones made today, and it's the same silhouette. They use that nostalgia to sell bikes. Royal Enfield, everybody's doing it. The Indian dealership experience and their lifestyle products and the racing brought back the name with a rush of new products and entertainment to make sure Polaris would succeed and Indian would stick around this time. King of the Baggers racing that basically got created when cruiser sales went down and they needed to bring the excitement back to it. Royal Enfield and Indian both got into flat track racing, so they're trying these. They're not new ways of promoting their products, but they're kind of forgotten, and they're not really. They weren't used for a very long time to promote products, and that's why it worked this time. So anyway, there's the timeline of Victory and a little bit about how selling motorcycles here works. And even though Victory's gone, they sort of continue on today as the new Indian motorcycles. So now we can move on to the best and worst of Victory. I guess the only really bad thing about Victory is that they're not around anymore. I haven't heard anyone complain about these bikes, and there aren't really any notorious issues that I could find. Same thing with Indian. I don't hear bad things about them. The only low point I can think of about Victory is the vision, which is more my opinion than anything else. And I already kind of talked about that. Something that gets brought up kind of often with Victory are the ways in which they were better than Harley. That's usually the viewpoint of someone who had or currently owns a Victory motorcycle. But anyway, Victory only had a few engines, so there weren't huge volumes of parts numbers and giant inventories required to maintain them. They also had a lot less places for oil to leak from. It's a very old and tired joke about Harley. But in real numbers, Victory had 8 oil seals, and a Harley of the same vintage, late 90s, early 2000s, had over 60. Victory had more valves per cylinder, and Harley guys usually chime in at this point about the Victory engine being bigger because it held oil in the cases, where a Harley uses a separate tank, so the Harley engine's more compact. We can go back and forth like that all day, but instead I'm just going to move on. So now we know the history, high and low points. Hopefully you learned something new and have a better picture of what the manufacturer was and where they got to be and what they're doing now, which they're not around now, but you know what I mean. Next up, I'm going to fill you in on my personal first-hand experience with the brand. As I alluded to before, I've ridden a Victory Vision. I think it's ugly, but comfortable. I've known a few people who have owned the various Victory bikes, and I know a guy who ran a Victory dealership back in the 90s and the early 2000s. I also know a guy who worked in the plant in Spirit Lake. I never heard complaints about any of the bikes from any of the people, other than they were difficult to sell. The Arlen Ness versions were very difficult to sell. I think that the Polaris transitioned really well from Victory to Indian, and I think they're doing a lot better now with Indian than they had ever done with Victory. I don't know what it's like to be an Indian dealership, and I haven't heard a ton about reliability, ease of ownership on Indians, but again, I don't see bad things when I look online. Personally, I don't really care to own either a Victory or an Indian, but that's just because their products really don't suit the way that I like to ride. Nothing in my experience would ever steer me away from either of those brands if I ever had the desire to own a cruiser. But if I ever won the lottery, you can bet there'd be an Arlen Ness Victory Vegas or an Indian FTR somewhere in my personal museum. So if you made it this far, I want to thank you for listening to me ramble on about Victory's history and probably referring back to Indian more than I should have. What I've owned, ridden on, all that sort of stuff I do at the end of the video. I try and put the opinions toward the end because not everyone wants to hear my personal opinions. It's very subjective and it might not paint your favorite brand in a positive light. Again, this is just what I have researched and experienced myself. So if you've owned or ridden these bikes from Victory, please let me know down in the comments section what your experience has been. That way we can all get a better idea as to whether I had pretty normal or pretty unusual experiences. If you'd like to hear about a specific manufacturer in the next episode, you can drop that down in the comments section. If you're a channel subscriber or even better, a supporter, I'll put a lot more weight into those suggestions. For the next episodes, do you think I should stick with American manufacturers or go somewhere overseas? I might do Boss Haas or Arch, which would probably be a shorter episode. I'm sort of putting off the Japanese Big Four and Harley, since that's such a monumental project to put together. But please let me know what you think and what you want to hear about. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll be back with another episode soon. Don't forget to do all the things to make the YouTube algorithm happy, like, subscribe, like the video. If you're a really wonderful person, consider supporting the channel. Thanks for watching.